On Thursday, the 23rd of April 2026, the NTSB released a very detailed preliminary report on the runway incursion accident that happened at LaGuardia airport on the 22nd of March 2026. The accident occurred when a CRJ 900 operating as Air Canada Express, or JAS, flight 8646, was arriving from Montreal in Canada and collided with an aircraft rescue firefighting, or ARFF, vehicle just after touching down on runway 04. Now, according to the report, this was the third and last flight of the day for the two CRJ pilots who were on the first day of a 4-day trip together. The captain had a total of 3,560 flight hours, of which 1,600 hours had been flown with JAS, and he had upgraded to captain just about 3.5 months before this accident. His first officer was the pilot flying for the flight, and he had a total of 718 flight hours, of which 435 were with this airline. Now, this is a preliminary report, so we don't know if all of the time that these two pilots had with the airline was on the CRJ 900 type, but we know that this was only the second trip that these two pilots had flown together. And tragically, neither of them survived this accident. But they were the only fatalities in this whole tragedy. Among the 2 flight attendants, 72 passengers, and the 2 ground crew in the ARFF vehicle, 39 people were transported to local hospitals, 6 of which with serious injuries. But everyone except those 2 pilots survived. Now, when we're looking at the crew in the firefighting vehicle, we now know that the driver had 3 years of experience and was at the time of the accident 5.5 hours into a 12-hour shift. The second occupant was a turret operator who had 12 years of ARFF experience and was 4.5 hours into a 12-hour shift. In the control tower, the controller that was talking to both the JAS aircraft and the firefighting vehicle when this happened had 18 years of experience and was 42 minutes into his shift. And it is now confirmed that there was also a second controller present with 19 years of experience and who was 51 minutes into his shift. And that second controller was at the time responsible for departure clearance deliveries and for handling the ground frequency, at least on paper. Initially, there was some uncertainty about which one of these 2 controllers was actually handling the ground frequency, because, you see, during a night shift, it was common for a single controller to handle both the tower and the ground frequencies. And this was the night shift for both of these controllers, but it was also a little bit too early in the evening for that procedure to be in place. This accident happened at approximately 11:37 in the evening, and the combining of tower and ground positions would generally only be done when the traffic volume went down after midnight. But at the time of this accident, the ground controller, who also had a supervisory role here, was busy coordinating the emergency of another aircraft, a United Boeing 737 MAX 8, which had performed 2 rejected takeoffs earlier in that evening. As this was happening, that aircraft was now sitting on a taxiway since its pilots had been unable to find an empty gate for their passengers, and since they were now also feeling some smoke and fumes in the cabin, they were considering whether or not they would need to evacuate, or at least to call for stairs to disembark their passengers on the taxiway. That situation meant that the ground controller had his hands full, and what the NTSB's preliminary report now explains is that the tower controller had therefore started handling some taxiing traffic to take a little bit of workload away from his colleague. Maybe you can see how the Swiss cheese layers are starting to line up and be crossed here. In any case, that other aircraft emergency was also the reason why the involved firefighting vehicle was on the move, and there were actually a total of 7 vehicles involved: 4 ARFF trucks, a tool truck, an air stair truck, and a Port Authority police car. When the tower controller cleared JAS flight 8646 to land on runway 04, the CRJ 900 was still on a 5-mile final at an altitude of about 1,900 feet, and all of the ARFF vehicles were still around the fire station area. They only started moving out 21 seconds after the tower had issued that landing clearance, and the vehicles then gathered at a taxiway intersection well clear of runway 04. Initially, another vehicle, the tool truck, was supposed to lead them all across the airport towards that stuck United aircraft. But that plan then changed because the crew in the tool truck had some difficulty contacting the tower. It looks like possibly they were stepped on, meaning that someone else was speaking on the same frequency when they tried to transmit, so their message never came out. This then meant that the involved trucks used their own radio frequency to coordinate swapping roles and places. And the truck that would later be involved in this accident positioned itself in the lead of the convoy. It then contacted the tower, saying that Truck 1 and company wanted to cross runway 04 at taxiway Delta, and the controller cleared them to do so, likely temporarily forgetting the landing clearance he had already issued. But LaGuardia also has a runway status lighting system just for this purpose, and 5 seconds before the controller cleared the vehicles to cross the runway, those runway entrance lights, or RELs, for this particular intersection on runway 04 and taxiway Delta had illuminated red. Now, I can't overemphasize how important this is. Everyone, including aircraft and ground vehicles, must never ever enter a runway when those lights are red. And that's even if a controller has given clearance to cross. In Europe, we have a red stop bar that goes across the taxiway like a barrier, but in the United States, the actual taxiway centerline light seems to play that same role, turning red when you're not allowed to enter, and then continuing for the whole segment that you're not allowed to use. But in this case, the lead vehicle with call sign Truck 1 now apparently started moving across those lights to cross the runway anyway. Meanwhile, crew in the other vehicles further back in the convoy saw the landing aircraft and said "Stop, stop, stop" on their own frequency. And the controller in the tower, who remember was now also giving some taxiway instructions to other aircraft at the same time, also saw the conflict with the landing aircraft and therefore radioed out an instruction to the truck to stop. Now at that point, the truck was still crossing taxiway Alpha Alpha, which is the parallel taxiway to runway 04, but from later interviews, it seems like the crew in the truck just didn't realize that this stop stop call on the radio was for them. The tower controller then repeated his instruction for the truck to stop when it was about 100 feet away from the edge of the runway, and by that point it was doing 29 miles or 47 kilometers per hour. Now, for some very curious reason, the REL lights then switched off, just as the firefighting vehicle got to the edge of the runway itself, something that can actually be seen in a video of the collision if you look at it, and the preliminary report doesn't explain why this happened. That happened 3 seconds before the collision, and a second later, as the CRJ had touched down and landed its nose wheel, the first officer handed over the controls of the aircraft to the captain. Now, the aircraft's ground speed at that moment was about 106 knots, with the firefighting truck doing 30 miles an hour now appearing right in front of them. The NTSB didn't release any information about the conversation from the pilots in the cockpit. That will likely come in the final report later on, but it is confirmed that the cockpit voice recorder did register the calls between the tower and the firefighting vehicle, so the two pilots likely did hear it. Just before the collision, the driver in the fire truck turned sharply left, and the aircraft had by then started braking, slowing it down to 90 knots just moments before impact. There was then also a 6-degree left rudder input from the pilots, but at that point it was already too late for anyone to stop the collision. Now, the NTSB's investigation also confirmed that ASDEX was operating at the time of the accident, and this is a system that allows tower controllers to track movements of aircraft and ground vehicles by using information from both ground radar and transponders. But the vehicles at LaGuardia were not equipped with transponders, so without those, the system could only use radar returns, which are much less reliable. This then meant that at the time of the accident, this system was only able to see 2 out of the 7 vehicles, and it never generated any oral or visual alerts. Likely because the radar returns were too intermittent to generate high-confidence tracks. Now, this investigation will now continue and eventually lead to a comprehensive final report within a year or so, and when it does, we will create a detailed, full video over on Mentor pilot. But for now, I hope that this shows you that, just as Ben and I talked about in our podcast, Captain Speaking, there were no one single thing or one single person to blame for this accident. As always, there were several causal factors, including systemic issues, who together ultimately led to this really tragic outcome. Now, my team and I would not have been able to create this video as fast as we have. The report was only just released if it wasn't for the support from our sponsor Incogni, who was super fast to answer our call. If you want a really effective way of making sure your personal data is not being sold online, Incogni is where you should go. I have been using them myself for over a year with great results, and if you want to reduce your digital footprint and get rid of some spam and robocalls, well then scan this QR code or go to incogni.com/mentor now. You can also support this type of work that we're doing by joining our Patreon community on patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. I will be hosting a Zoom hangout there soon, maybe together with Ben actually, where we will discuss this report in more detail and answer your questions. So hopefully, I'll see you there. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching a special video from Mentor Now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.